First I want to do one order of business, and that is welcome one of our new Transportation Commission members, Aylin Davis. Aylin, what's your, Schold Davis? Welcome. And the council made 3 appointments this past Tuesday. We'll have 2 more members joining us next time. But Aylin, do you want to tell us something about yourself?
Sure. Thank you. Yes, my name is Aylin Schold Davis, and I've lived in Edina for something like 12 or 15 years. I have to do the math. I'm very interested in transportation. I'm an occupational therapist by profession, and I work for our national association. So my office is actually in Washington, D.C., and I've been involved in national transportation agendas for the last 8 years. So I was very interested in figuring out or learning more about what Edina's doing, and I'm just hoping that I can bring some of the perspective that I've been learning home, and I'm really excited to see if I can share and just be an active part in our local community. So I look forward to participating. Thank you.
We're going to skip over the approval of minutes, and we'll do that next time. On the consent agenda was the traffic safety report from December 1st, 2010. And did anybody see anything that they had questions about? No? Okay, we'll move on. The next item is community comment, and this is an opportunity if anybody here has a question or comment for the Transportation Commission, come up. You've got 3 minutes before the mic. Is anybody here for a comment? Come up, please say your name and state your address.
39 West 44th Street, and it's really a question. Is this the only time to comment this evening?
Yes, it is.
Sorry, that's okay. That's okay. Thank you very much, Jack.
Yes.
This is.
Yes. Is there something you want us to consider at a later point?
Just the presentation, which we appreciate on the freight train. This is an issue, I think, it's the issue that St. Louis Park has been up in arms in for quite some time. This is the first time that I think we've talked about it as a community. And I think as it's publicized and the information that gets out, there should be, or will be, I think, some considerable concerns here as well. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you for coming. And do we have, we're going to have a presentation here, and I think a similar presentation will be given to the council.
Yes, Mr. Christensen is also scheduled to brief the council at the February 1st meeting. So just a couple weeks, a week and a half from now or so, he'll be giving a very similar presentation at that time frame. This discussion tonight and those individuals that are out there watching this on TV may spur some additional comments or questions. Certainly ask that those comments or questions get emailed into the city, to the city council members, so they can appropriately get those questions answered.
I agree with that. So if you have follow-up questions or comments after you've heard the presentation tonight, send them to the council at Edina Mail, one word, at cityofedina.com, or regular mail here at City Hall. And then council meetings also have a public comment period, but I believe that's at the end of the meeting. So a little bit different. All right, so Jack, do you want to come up and introduce our guest tonight, please?
Chair and Commission members. This evening, we have with us Dave Christensen from MnDOT. He's with the Office of Freight Rail and Commercial Vehicle Operations. Mr. Christensen has been in the occupation of train transit for the last 25 years. In the last couple of years, he's been in charge of the Freight Rail Division for MnDOT's Transportation Planning Division, and he's been involved in state rail plan, statewide transportation investment policies, local freight rail planning, truck support services, and parking. So if there's something to do with freight rail within the greater Minnesota, and I guess more detailed, the metro, Dave is a guy. He's been involved extensively in a lot of the discussions that are happening with the Southwest LRT, the discussions that we've probably been hearing about in the newspaper regarding St. Louis Park and some of the operations with Kenilworth Corridor and some of the constraints that are happening up there. And we thought it was a good idea for him to give a quick presentation here this evening with some question and answer as well. And then another follow-up presentation on February 1st to the City Council that will help City of Edina residents understand what's happening to the north, how that will or will not impact our community, and regionally, and then also statewide. And we even talked to one of our previous meetings nationally how some of the rail trends are and what we think the City of Edina can expect for services to our community, and if there's any opportunity for other discussion outside of the current freight rail that we have running from north to south through Edina. So with that, I'll pass it over to Dave and let him fill you in on more of the details. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Chair Genovi, members of the commission, and guests, thank you for inviting me here tonight. We'll go on and talk about freight and passenger rail issues that impact Edina and the greater metro area in Minnesota. You're looking at a map right now of the entire rail system in the state of Minnesota. There's approximately 4,500 miles of track in the state. Almost 500 miles of that is in the metro area. That is down from 9,000 miles of operating trackage in 1980 when the railroads were deregulated. Since then, there's been a lot of merging. A lot of branch lines have been abandoned, obviously wholesale in a lot of areas. But we have a much more efficient and very profitable system now. 95% of the trackage that you're looking at in the map is privately owned by 4 major railroads and about 16 short lines. Those railroads include the Canadian National, the Canadian Pacific, the Union Pacific, and the Burlington Northern Santa Fe. The Burlington Northern Santa Fe operates about 2/3 of the trackage in the state and is a major carrier both on transcontinental routes from Seattle to Chicago and in the Iron Range. So you can see that we move about 230 million tons of freight every year on the railroads, both originating and terminating in the state, which is about 2/3 of our tonnage, and another third is overhead traffic coming into and then going on through the state. That accounts for about 38% of all the freight moved in the state, as opposed to the national average of about 12%. So that shows you how important the rail is in this state, in particular for a lot of the commodities that we have and we rely on in our economy. Iron ore, for one, is virtually all moved by rail at some point in the process as it heads down to the ports for loading onto the ships. A large portion of our lumber business and paper products are moved by rail, and of course agricultural products. About 1/3 of our corn production, our biggest single commodity in the state from agriculture, is turned into ethanol. About half of that moves out of the state in tank cars. The other 2/3 of the corn is about 1/3 used in the state for feedlots and processing, and the other third is for export business. Again, moving out of the state almost entirely these days in unit trains. A minority share of it moves in barges now. So you can see it's very important. Future trends that we're looking at is that our overall freight volumes are going to grow by about 1.5% to 2% a year following the recession. Now, the recession broke the chain. In 2007, the freight railroads in the United States had the biggest year in their 170-year history. They moved more freight, more profitably, and faster than at any time in their history. The recession saw a drop of about 15% in traffic over the last 2 years, but it is already starting to grow again, particularly container traffic, and we expect that by the end of next year it'll be back up to historic levels and continuing to grow. High-speed intercity rail is something new on the horizon. It's going to affect everything that happens, particularly in the Chicago area, but also in larger cities in the Midwest, including Minneapolis and St. Paul. It is a new federal initiative. It's being pushed by local corridors and stakeholders. Initially, there is a joint powers group working between Minneapolis and Duluth for high-speed rail, moving at 110 miles per hour between those two cities. And there has been a group of 9 states pushing for high-speed rail from Chicago to several different areas, including Detroit, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, St. Louis, and of course the Twin Cities. The Twin Cities portion is already operating between Chicago and Milwaukee, the Hiawatha corridor. 7 trains a day operating up to 90 miles per hour. And as we get through the planning phases, we're looking at possibly having high-speed rail moving at 110 miles per hour top speed between Chicago and the Twin Cities, hopefully within the next 6 years, if there is a federal funding program finally settled on and we finish our planning work. A portion of the system that we have right now, because of the growth in freight rail and the fact that we're looking at commuter rail and passenger rail on top of that, is already at capacity. A lot of the Burlington Northern Santa Fe line from Fargo-Moorhead through to Prescott, Wisconsin, is operating at capacity. The Canadian Pacific lines from the Twin Cities south to La Crosse and then on to Chicago are operating at capacity as well. And those are key corridors we want to put passenger trains on. So there will have to be a lot of investment and a lot of expansion. The Minnesota Rail Plan, which includes the map that you looked at, was completed through the year 2009, adopted by the State Commissioner, Mr. Tom Sorrell, on February 9th, 2010. It has since been moved on and approved by the federal government and is our first document in the state ever to look at passenger and freight rail as a public responsibility and venture. That doesn't mean that we're going to be buying out the freight railroads and investing a lot of money in them. It does mean that we have a consistent plan for keeping short lines and freight railroads and passenger operations in balance and growing in the state with state support, which we've never had before. This is a map of the passenger rail system that has been planned out in the state rail plan. It's interesting to note that we had the largest public participation of any planning effort in the state at the state level in history. During the year 2009, we had 3 meetings of the Policy Advisory Committee for the group, 150 or more active members. It took the auditorium in the Minnesota History Center to hold them all. Every time we had a meeting, we webcast that meeting and had telephone conferences every time we held that meeting as well. We also toured this plan in 3 separate stages to open houses around the state in 7 separate cities. Each of those rounds of open houses saw participation between 800 and 1,000 people, about 3 times more than we had for the state transportation plan the year before. So there's a lot of interest out there. As you can see in the line, we have the connection to Chicago, possible diversion to Madison, which is a major population center in Wisconsin that happens to be the state capital, has 350,000 people there. Also a big basketball and football opponent to the U of M, the Wisconsin Badgers there, but we won't give them too much advantage by giving them a train. That train continues on to La Crosse through the Wisconsin Dells and up the river in the proposed route that's being studied. There are alternates to that route being studied through Eau Claire, Wisconsin, which is a city of about 125,000 and actually has a better rail line, faster route, but less population along the way, and then through Rochester is one of the other alternatives that we're studying at this moment. Now, when you get to the Twin Cities, you see it looks like a hub and spoke system. There is a 155-mile length, like I said, that we're in the advanced planning stages of, to Duluth and Superior. That would run 6 to 8 trains per day at 110 miles per hour, carrying between 700,000 and 1 million people a year by ridership projections. We have a branch reaching out to Fargo-Moorhead through St. Cloud and Staples. We have another branch going down to Mankato, about 90 miles away, which surprisingly showed a heavy ridership forecast, partly because trains running at 90 to 110 miles per hour in that corridor would vastly provide an improvement to people traveling around the metro area and out on 169. And then a route to Rochester, which on its own would be able to have independent utility, probably move about 300 to 400,000 people a year, as opposed to driving on Highway 52, and with a top speed exceeding 150 miles per hour. Because in this corridor alone, because there's no direct existing freight rail route, we would be building a new route, similar to an interstate, but it would actually be a high-speed direct rail line across farmland to reach downtown Rochester and the Mayo Clinic. And then, of course, Eau Claire. That's not a part of Minnesota, but it is a regional trade center that's very important to the Twin Cities, and the Twin Cities is important to Eau Claire, 90 miles away. A lot of commuter traffic going on there. The intermediate cities of Menominee and Hudson are on that route. And again, it has high ridership potential. So it's included in part of the plan. All of these will be operating at a minimum of 90 miles per hour up to 110 miles per hour, and represent a very good improvement in travel options and travel speeds. In the metro area, we're looking at all of those train routes meeting at two different hubs. One would be the North Star Station, what we call the Minneapolis Transportation Interchange in downtown Minneapolis, right next to and under the Target baseball field. And then St. Paul Union Depot. We had the groundbreaking on St. Paul Union Depot for its improvements and expansion and return to operation as a transit hub just 2 days ago. I was there at that groundbreaking. They actually had to back home and started tearing down the old post office garages because the post office has moved out. They've sold everything to Ramsey County. And by the end of 2012, the Amtrak Empire Builder will be moving from Midway Station between the two downtowns and along University Avenue into St. Paul Union Depot as its major stop in the metro area. All the high-speed trains and regional trains would be coming in from neighboring cities would move through both of these Union stations. And then there would be about a 20-minute connection between the two stations on virtually every run between Minneapolis and St. Paul, which provides also another link for commuter traffic and for travelers between the two downtowns. So it's a very busy area we're looking at. There are two routes that we could use between the two downtowns and, of course, connections to outer areas. Some of the things that happen in Edina is that if we go back and look at the map, you can see coming southwest out of downtown Minneapolis, there is a red line that changes to a blue line near Lake Calhoun and Lake of the Isles, and then goes on down through St. Louis Park and toward Hopkins. That's the old Milwaukee Road main line. It's now Twin Cities and Western, and also known as the Kenilworth Corridor, where Hennepin County owns the rail past the lakes and underneath the bluffs of Kenwood up there. That is the approved and preferred route for Southwest Light Rail. It was just approved by the county board earlier or late last year. Now that light rail system will start construction tentatively in 2016. Central Corridor, which is going to link downtown Minneapolis through the U of M campus along University Avenue and into downtown St. Paul, and then end right in front of St. Paul Union Depot. About a 55-minute ride for a high-capacity transit mode will be completed in 2014. So 2 years after Union Depot actually gets up and running as an active transit hub. And then in 2016, we'll start construction on Southwest Rail. Now, if that line goes through Kenilworth Corridor, that means that direct freight service to downtown Minneapolis from Twin Cities and Western and Minnesota Prairie Line out to the west of us will be cut off, because at least as it now stands, the right-of-way in that corridor is only about 65 feet wide. You need 38 feet of that width to handle the double tracks of a light rail operation, and then 50 feet alongside that to handle a single-track freight line. Now, the city originally wanted to put the freight line through there, the light rail through there, and the bike path, which currently exists in that corridor. Obviously, there's not enough room for all of that, so something has to give. One of the issues that we have now is that as Southwest Light Rail is developed, and we're looking at options of what to do with the existing freight lines, because as I mentioned, freight is very important for the state. This connection with Twin Cities and Western, which is a short line, a local operation that is headquartered here in the western suburbs, is very important to several ethanol plants, grain elevators, and quarries out in western Minnesota. In fact, that line reaches all the way to the Dakota border. As we move forward with this, it is federal law that a freight railroad has to have access to the rest of the national system. It's called the Commerce Clause in the Constitution and interstate commerce protection for freight railroads that move across borders and interchange traffic across borders. So it's not a state issue or a city issue, it's a national issue. That said, because they have trackage rights over that Hennepin County trackage, somewhere we have to take care of how they get to the rest of the system. That's the crux of the matter in St. Louis Park at this point. If we cannot find a way to put the track through Kenilworth, then there's one other option. If we go back and look at the map, you can see on the west side there's a red line reaching from the bottom of the map right up to North Minneapolis, across the entire left-hand side of the map. That used to be called the Dan Patch Line. It was built in about 1908 as an interurban, which means it was supposed to be an electric trolley running on a single track from Minneapolis to Northfield. It was called the Dan Patch Line because it terminated at Northfield Farms, which hosted Dan Patch, a famous racer, trotting horse, that was probably the biggest rock star in the late 19th century. When we look at people like Shaquille O'Neal today, Dan Patch was Shaquille O'Neal of his day, even though he was a horse. So that line was built by the owners of that farm and the owners of the horse to connect them to Minneapolis. Now it's a freight railroad and owned by the Canadian Pacific, except for the bridge across the Minnesota River at Savage, which is owned by the Twin Cities and Western. They bought it 7 years ago for $1 because it was starting to need some heavy repairs, and at the time the Canadian Pacific thought they were making a good deal. Well, that bridge is still in operation and is now a critical part of a very strategic link, because that line is the only way to get freight north and south through the western side of the Metro District. That said, if we move freight out of Kenilworth, it will have to transfer onto that line. A lot of the public hearings that we've had up in St. Louis Park, and I'm on the MnDOT management team that is taking part in that debate, is that Hennepin County, in trying to plan for where that freight should go, made a preemptive assumption that the freight lines would just move on to the Canadian Pacific from TC&W, even though there's not an interchange there connecting the two railroads, and move past Kenilworth so we could put the light rail down that line. The neighborhoods in St. Louis Park immediately reacted, as most of you are well aware. That's an ongoing debate in the public process. We're looking at the environmental assessment for that line and those connections. And the Hennepin County was forced to go back and reinstitute a study of Kenilworth Corridor, which is still going on. So we have actually three options. Those two options and another option, rebuilding trackage alongside 169, which would be a complete rebuild of 15 miles of railroad that doesn't exist today. Probably a very low likelihood, but again, one of the three options that the county and the metro area, Metropolitan Council and MnDOT are looking at. So we have those on the table. No decisions have been made yet, but obviously you've seen a lot in the paper about it. Some of you may have been to the meetings up there in St. Louis Park, and it plays a very important part in what goes on in the future. Obviously, people from Edina will be riding the Southwest Light Rail, so you have an interest in that as well. But the freight is still an important matter. Now, because that line goes north and south through Edina, it will play a very important part in what happens with traffic in the future here. There are several things that happen. If the Savage Bridge, for instance, is put back in operation, or if grain movement from TC&W pick up again for export through the Savage terminals, and Savage is the largest grain exporting terminal in Minnesota, second only to Duluth. It's the largest grain exporting port on the entire Mississippi River. So at the headwaters of the entire northern Mississippi River, you've got this huge grain terminal with 5 private elevators up there. When there are exports of grain, a lot of it moves through there. Right now, there's not a whole lot. We're down over 35% in grain traffic from just last year, which was another drop from 30% from the year before. Partly because of rail competition, partly because of the international markets. But that could change overnight. And then you could have grain trains running south from the TC&W onto this track across the Savage Bridge, which hasn't been done in 5 years, but going through the city of Edina. The other thing that we're looking at is, if you noticed on the state rail plan, Mankato is a very viable terminus for one of the branches of high-speed rail in the state. Obviously a major regional trade center, a college town, major agricultural and industrial center down there. There is a direct link on the Union Pacific, a very high-grade line, good condition, high speed, directly in the St. Paul Union Depot. But if commuters and travelers from Mankato want to access downtown Minneapolis, they will either have to transfer to a bus or light rail, or we would have to open up the connections again up the Dan Patch line, the Canadian Pacific, and into downtown Minneapolis to the Minneapolis Transportation Interchange, the Union Depot there, North Star Station. That is a very likely option, although the Dan Patch line has enough curves and grades and is in poor condition. It would take a lot of investment to do it. And even then, the trains probably would not travel through Edina at any speed higher than probably 60 to 65 miles per hour. But there could be that train traffic moving through the city. About 4 trains a day is what we're estimating in each direction, a total of 8 train trips. Right now, there is only 1 trip per day in each direction for a switching move, where the Canadian Pacific interchanges cars with Progressive Rail down in Bloomington on their branch. So they could see a major increase in traffic. And again, because of grain exports or something else, freight traffic could also increase. So there's a wide variance. Some of it we will plan. Obviously, if we're doing high-speed rail on that line, it would be a public process. There would be more open houses and planning going on, probably over the next 6 years. If we get funding and see that people are actively involved in that corridor, freight traffic, because it is a private venture and it happens at the stroke of a pen on a contract, could change at any moment. The one thing we're looking at in St. Louis Park, which is what all the uproar is about, is that we would be building a new elevated interchange there between T&C and W that would link them nonstop without any trains slowing or any interruption of traffic or braking of trains, both northbound on the Canadian Pacific into North Minneapolis and also onto the Burlington Northern Santa Fe past the Twin Stadium, and also south to Savage and south to Northfield, continuing on. So that interchange would possibly start to generate more traffic on this line. That said, we also are looking at the fact that there have been proposals. David Davison came in here a few weeks back to the Council and Transportation Committee talking about an LRT line on there. There are initiatives from the Transportation Commission and other proponents to put a bike path on that right-of-way. There are several issues as we look at that, and this is a map of all the rail lines in the Twin Cities. You can see where that red line, Canadian Pacific, goes all the way south to Northfield, ties into Iowa, Rochester, and other areas. And to the north, it ties into the Canadian Pacific line that goes on to Winnipeg, Canada, and to the transcontinental lines up there. So this is a very important link. It could create a lot of diversion of traffic if it was needed. I talked about the Dan Patch line and who owns it and the connections that it has. The Savage Swing Bridge sometime in the next 10 years will have to be replaced at a cost of about $30 to $40 million. And that may be, again, a project helped by MnDOT so that TC&W could finance it, or by Canadian Pacific, but it could happen. I talked about the level of train traffic and the potential for adding freight in the future. Challenges to that expansion, of that ever happening. Again, the swing bridge is in very poor condition. It's used probably only twice a month right now. And short trains, 5 to 10 cars at 10 miles per hour to cross it, although it is still active. The track condition on the Dan Patch line allows only a 10 mile per hour maximum speed today because of the size of the rail and the condition of the ties in the roadbed. That has its positives and its negatives. One, it keeps traffic off the line. It prevents use at higher speeds, which causes more vibration and possible safety issues at the grade crossings in the city. On the other hand, because the track is in poor condition, it creates more noise and vibration as the trains run across the jointed rail. Upgrading that track to a 25 or even a 50 mile per hour average with welded rail and good roadbed would actually decrease the noise and vibration in the city and allow for less blockage of grade crossings. So there's positives and negatives on both of those. We have several grade crossings in the city that would have to be upgraded if there was more traffic. Also, the important part here is that the right-of-way, that is the land owned by the railroad from border to border, that the rail track is laid within, is not a normal railroad right-of-way. When the railroads were starting to be built in the 1850s and 1860s in Minnesota, several of the railroads were provided with land grants from the federal government, some from the state. Only the Great Northern, James J. Hill lines, was built totally with private money and no land grants whatsoever. So the largest railroad in the state was not supported by the federal government when it was built. James J. Hill financed it every foot of the way with his own money and the money that they generated from freight traffic. They called him the Empire Builder because at one point in time, he was probably the richest man in America and living here in the Twin Cities. That said, as we move ahead at this point, all of those older railroads were built with at least 110, sometimes 150-foot right-of-way exactly parallel to the direction and the route of the railroad line. So you've got a nice clean line, a wide right-of-way. If you come in on some of these railroad lines that only have a single-track main line, you've got a lot of land on both sides. We have areas in the state where we're using bike trails and snowmobile trails right on the edge of the railroad property. And it doesn't interfere with railroad traffic, and it's fairly safe because of the distance between the trains and those lines. The Dan Patch line, because it was built about 20 years after this city was chartered and platted and started to become settled, Bloomington was chartered even earlier, and St. Louis Park was chartered about the same time. All the cities that this rail line was planned for to move through already had property lines drawn. So the railroad came in here, surveyed a line down through the middle of the cities, but then had to buy platted property to put together the right-of-way. So wherever there's a curve or something off the plat lines, you've got a sawtooth profile. And in some cases, and this is an issue in St. Louis Park, the track may be within 10 feet of a corner of a property line. Other places it might be 75 feet away from the property line. In some places it might be right next to the garage or a house, 35 feet away. And in other places nowhere close to anything because the rail line's going like this, but the property lines are jagging back and forth as they were purchased. That's an issue in Edina as well. And so to put a bike path alongside the railroad track has some very significant problems. First, to keep the bike path far enough away from the rail line or fence it so that you don't have bike riders or pedestrians interfering and trespassing on railroad property. And secondly, because in some places you have a narrow enough right-of-way that it will be very hard to fit it through without taking some property. The same thing is in effect for light rail. As I mentioned, freight railroading, even though it's a private venture, is federally protected as interstate commerce. It's part of our national transportation system and has always been considered as an irreplaceable component of that system. So you cannot just condemn the railroad line. In fact, every railroad in the country has the right of eminent domain, has had it ever since they were first chartered in the 1830s on the East Coast. And a jurisdiction, by state law and by federal law, cannot condemn another entity that has eminent domain rights. So, in fact, they could try to condemn property in the city of Edina, and they couldn't do it against the city if it was public property any more than the city of Edina could try to condemn the railroad line. St. Paul just tried that. They failed on 3 counts, and they still have the case in court. The Canadian Pacific filed a countersuit and then left it hanging. But they tried to put a bike path in along Aid Mill Road, which is actually owned by the Canadian Pacific as well, and it will not happen. In the meantime, we also want to double track that line if we do have high-speed rail coming through there, because that is the Empire Builder route for the Amtrak train that comes through and is a primary connection between the 2 downtowns. That's an issue here. If we had light rail running along the line, again, the same issue is that you can't use a railroad track or condemn and remove the railroad track for that light rail line. you could tie in the rail lines of Southwest Rail and run straight south through St. Louis Park, through Edina, and down to Savage, and maybe into Shakopee across the Minnesota River. Of course, if you ever cross the Minnesota River with light rail, there are a half a dozen communities would like to see light rail connections down there, in particular Burnsville and Lakeville. They'd be clamoring for that connection. But first you have to get down there. To get down there along the existing railroad line is problematic, however, because to put 38 feet in a constricted right-of-way and still maintain the freight railroad line is just the same issue as we're having right now in Kenilworth, to put it bluntly. So those are the issues that we have. As I say, it is very hard to predict what's going to happen with this line in the future, but keep your eyes on St. Louis Park. If the county and the Metropolitan Council and MnDOT, on their way to building Southwest Light Rail, decide that the most cost-effective and efficient way to move traffic, freight traffic, is through St. Louis Park on the Dan Patch line and up to the Burlington, Northern Santa Fe, and downtown Minneapolis, then there will be a lot of changes up there. We're talking about some major mitigation at grade crossings, pedestrian overpasses, bike overpasses, and not just on the railroad line, but in places like across Highway 7. We have high school students right now, every morning and every evening, walking across the railroad bridge in order to get across 7, because there is no more direct route to get to the southern neighborhoods in St. Louis Park than across that railroad bridge. There is no road intersection within half a mile of that crossing in either direction, and no pedestrian pathways or bridges across the highway. So they're trespassing every time they do it, and luckily there is very little train traffic on that line, but if there were more train traffic, that would become very, very dangerous. Probably there was, the site of a fatal accident at some point. So we have to provide for all of that pedestrian traffic, bike traffic. We're looking at the addition of a north service road along 7, again, to prevent queuing lines and to relieve traffic at the grade crossings, and then putting in possibly a quiet zone through St. Louis Park, which means that every grade crossing in the city would either be closed, and there's one good candidate for closure, 4 other candidates for improved safety, which means that we would put in medians in the roads, 4 quadrant gates, which means that at a grade crossing, every single lane of traffic would be blocked by a gate and bells and whistles at the time that a train was coming through. Now, a train, especially a longer, heavier train, takes between a quarter mile and a half mile, even at 10 or 20 miles per hour to stop. So it's not an issue that if the locomotive engineer sees somebody on the track, he can put on the brakes and stop the train. It's always been the case, and that's why railroads have the right of way, that vehicles and pedestrians have to take responsibility for stopping at those safety gates. So we would have to put in pedestrian gates as well, and pedestrian barriers. We still don't provide 100% safety, but again, it's a huge improvement. And if those gates are put in to completely seal the crossings when a train comes through, then by federal law, we can instruct the railroad to turn off their horns, and they don't have to blow the horns. Now, horns these days, when a locomotive engineer blows his horn, it's 110 decibels, just at the lower limits of pain. And anybody who lives near the tracks knows that that's a major source of the noise. So to take that noise down to 0 would be a big improvement for the neighborhoods, but at a cost that would be rolled into the project if we do it. The other issue, again, is pedestrian safety, and that means fencing the right-of-ways, putting in better tracks so that we don't face derailments or any problems in that area. By putting in this interchange, we will no longer have to stop trains and break them up and switch a few cars at a time to get onto that track. In St. Louis Park, on that line, or north on the Burlington Northern, trains will be able to just travel straight through without stopping and clear the grade crossings a lot faster. But when all that happens, then it has the result of opening up that line and Edina to more freight traffic. And that's the issue that would overflow here. Besides having Southwest Light Rail then clear to be built, and having that as an option for your commutes into town, and tying into the rest of the light rail system. But that's what the future looks like, or could look like. Like I say, the decision has not been made by Hennepin County and the Metropolitan Council and MnDOT as to what is preferred route yet. It might involve, instead of going through St. Louis Park, simply taking some land along the Kenilworth corridor. That would actually be more expensive than building the line through St. Louis Park, more than likely because of the heavy settlement with high-rise condominiums and the like on either side of that narrow corridor. There's about a quarter of a mile in the middle of Kenilworth where the right-of-way is only 65 feet wide. Not only that, but there are condominiums and apartments built right up to the boundary line of that property on both sides. So we could leave them there, but it would be a case of a freight train coming within 3 feet of somebody's window. And I don't think that would ever be allowed. So we have to keep that in mind and allow for that. But taking those residential properties in that area would be very expensive and very prone to public protest as well. So those are the issues we're looking at. I'm open for questions now. If you have any questions about the light rail or anything else, Commissioner. On the railroad itself, all they can do is if, for instance, a grade crossing is blocked more than 10 minutes, that's against state law. And then it's a complaint to your local police department. And they can fine the railroad. You can also report to MnDOT, and we go and talk to the railroad and inform them of the violation and ask for corrective measures. The other things that go on, the condition of the line, parking of freight cars on a given siding, for instance. We've had a lot of issues because of the rise of ethanol shipments along the TCNW in St. Louis Park. People complaining about a loaded tank car tentatively filled with ethanol and with a hazardous placard on the side parked right next to the city street. Well, that's entirely legal. It's part of interstate commerce. It's part of railroad operations. Luckily, ethanol is a very benign hazardous material. It's only flammable and burns at a very low temperature. It burns cool enough, in fact, that it doesn't melt or distort metal or anything else, but of course that is still a hazard. But it's not an explosion hazard, it's not an inhalation hazard or anything more serious like that. That said, people still get very nervous when that happens. We have no recourse to that except to talk to the railroad and to try and make their operations more public-friendly and more efficient. In the case of TCNW, we've worked with them to move their storage of loaded tank cars out into the outer suburbs and the rural areas and only keep empty tank cars for switching in the St. Louis Park yards. That said, once the trains are loaded, they will be coming through downtown past the Twin Stadium and are always there. The option to that, of course, is to run all that traffic by a truck out of the ethanol plants. For every loaded tank car that moves, you've got 4 to 5 tank trucks worth of material that have about a 2 times higher accident rate and spillage rate than the railroads have ever had. So in a matter of public safety, it's best to keep it on the railroad. The other issues we have about maintaining grade crossing signals and gates, that's the railroad's responsibility to maintain that. If something isn't working, they need to be advised of that immediately. There's usually contact numbers on the local grade crossing equipment, and the police department has all their numbers as well. Beyond that, there's very little that can be done. The exception is this project in St. Louis Park, because this is tentatively about a $70 million interchange to be built in terms of construction cost, and TCNW is a very marginally financed, family-owned business. They would need public help as part of the process of clearing the way for Southwest light rail. And because they're leaving the normal right-of-way for us to build these tracks in the interchange to curve around up and over to get onto the ways, we're going through a public environmental process. And this is the reason for the open houses and public hearings in St. Louis Park. Now, anybody who wants to comment on what happens there or in the immediate area with rail traffic and the mitigation and protection for citizens and recourse by the railroads to, to help make it a quieter and safer place to live, can happen during this public process, because we cannot move ahead with the project until, one, a decision is made by the parties who will have to finance it and construct the various transportation options, and secondly, the federal government has to sign off on the environmental impact statement. And they require that all public comment is taken into consideration, and if it's valid and significant, it has to be mitigated. So we have something different than what happens with normal private railroads. We have a lot more leverage in this case than we normally would have.
Yes, Mr. Christensen, a couple questions. One was for the current maximum speed on that Dan Patch line, or the freight line. You said 10 miles an hour. Is that correct? And the right-of-way width on that is?
The right-of-way width on that line is as narrow as 60 feet and as wide as 150 feet, depending on the plat lines and the bordering property.
And then you also implied that there could not be dual lines along that path due to the lack of width, correct?
Right, unless you ended up condemning some neighboring property and widening the right-of-way in certain places.
Now, was there any potential for that rail line being used as passenger?
Yeah, there is. As we did the state rail plan, we looked at the Mankato connection and having intercity rail running on that line to downtown Minneapolis. Obviously, Minneapolis, with 160,000 jobs downtown and 35,000 residents, is a major destination, as well as sporting events, cultural events, and everything else. People from Mankato and from Jordan and Shakopee would like to have rail connections. The one thing we can't do, by state law that was enacted in 2000, is that we cannot study that as a commuter rail line. There is a specific legislative ban against looking at that line for commuter rail purposes. A commuter rail is different from intercity rail. Intercity rail is higher speed, relatively long distances between stations and population areas, normally 15, 25, as much as 50 miles between station stops, and intended to get people from endpoint to endpoint as fast as possible, bypass congestion and everything else. Commuter traffic, and that happens all day long, 7 days a week, early in the morning to late at night. Commuter rail has a specific definition of being trips to work and return from work. And the station stops are usually spaced about 5 miles apart. That's what North Star is designed to do, going to the northwest up to Big Lake through Anoka County. And if you had commuter rail, you could very much envision having a commuter rail stop as probably the last stop here in Edina or in St. Louis Park on the way into Minneapolis, as it stops every 5 miles collecting passengers to go to work. During the midday, there would not be any service. But like I say, until state law is changed, and Mayor Hovland has been one of the proponents to have that ban dropped, but they tried to do it last legislative session, and it was they actually filibustered the law that it was added to, and so it was taken out again. Until that happens, the Metropolitan Council and MnDOT cannot do any planning or studies for that. Without planning, we cannot move ahead for funding proposals to the federal government, Federal Transit Administration, or invest any public money on this corridor for that purpose only.
So as is any passenger rail, intercity rail, speed limit on that line right now would also be 10 miles an hour?
Right now it would be 10 miles per hour. As the trackage was improved, like I said, we could probably reach a top speed of 60 to 65 miles per hour. Okay. The limiting factor there would be the railroad would be built at a condition that could handle trains up to 79 miles per hour. Is called Federal Class 4 because they do the inspections and make sure it's up to good engineering conditions. But because of the curves and bridges and grade crossings and the like, the top practical speed would probably be no more than 60.
Okay. And then I'm sorry, one more thing. You implied that the bike path that was just approved here in the city may have some difficulty in going forward?
It may have. A lot of that will depend upon participation and agreement by Canadian Pacific, the owner of the line. And wherever there is a disagreement, obviously some negotiations between the railroad and the city as to how to handle the physical limitations at a given point.
Could I ask a clarification on that? The multi-use trail that was just approved runs along 9 Mile Creek, and I know that the different trail has been proposed along the CP, but that hasn't worked through a process. So are we talking about the same trail?
Yes.
We are talking about the same trail. So the 9 Mile Creek Regional Trail that has just been approved with Three Rivers Park District.
Yep, that's fine.
That one's fine.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the one that Three Rivers has, in their dream on the CP, which would be the north-south. Okay, all right. So this is a lot of information, and I'm going to have to watch this tape back to absorb it all. And I spent no, it's fine. I spent a few hours. I think it might have been in November, looking at the 2030 rail plan. Reading some meeting minutes. I've been on the St. Louis Park email thing for quite a while. It's a lot of information to absorb. And so in terms of what could happen in Edina, there are actually two things. One would be an increase in freight rail if the interchange is built in St. Louis Park because the freight trail has been moved off Kenilworth. So is that issue number one? And then the issue number...
And the second part of that, the freight expansion has two pieces. One would be traffic generated by the TC&W if the interchange is built.
Mm-hmm.
You're exactly right on that. The other one might be Canadian Pacific through traffic. If the Savage Swing Bridge were rebuilt,
Okay.
that would allow them a clear transit or transportation link from North Minneapolis and their major rail yards and their intermodal yard up there, the piggyback terminal, all the way to Northfield and down into Iowa.
Okay, so if those two things happen, that could increase freight traffic on the CP. The second thing is passenger rail for the Mankato line.
Correct.
Okay, so those are two different things that are independent, but they're on the same tracks.
Exactly.
Okay. Wow, my
Good,
research paid off. Okay, so in terms of there are the big question marks still happening in St. Louis Park, so we don't know what is being moved on independent of that. So is the Savage Bridge, is that really being
There are no
worked
plans
on
for
that?
replacing or improving that bridge at this moment because there's no distinct need for it.
Okay,
At this point in time, there's no freight traffic headed for the Savage terminals, for instance. Like I said, the barge traffic that generates out of those terminals is very low right now. In fact, most of those terminals are being used to hold grain for milling purposes and transfer from truck into rail. So actually, rails have replaced the barges, and of course, and then that reduces the need for the bridge because the trains are actually originating out of those terminals and heading south instead of coming from western Minnesota and then going across the bridge to reach those terminals.
if that bridge were to be rebuilt, would that be triggered by private development, or does MnDOT have an interest in rebuilding that?
It could be either one.
Okay.
If we were to put passenger trains on that line, that bridge would absolutely have to be rebuilt.
And then so who makes that decision? Who says we're going to go forward and invest in the Twin Cities to Mankato line for passenger rail?
Yeah, basically the party who has the interest. If the only improvement or expansion of traffic that would be considered would be Mankato passenger rail, intercity rail to Minneapolis, then it would be MnDOT. If it was one of the private companies, Twin Cities and Western or Canadian Pacific, or for that matter, a connecting railroad like Union Pacific that would have an interest in it for freight purposes because of a new contract or new freight route for coal or wheat or gravel or something like that, then they would have to judge whether or not it was worth investing the money for the long term to improve that bridge. And they would do it without any government help or intervention at all.
In St. Louis Park by moving the connection point further north up to the CP, for example, so that railroads could go up there, go through their maneuver up there to go through a diagonal run to connect to the north-south run and come all the way back down. Then there'd only be the bridge to deal with. Yeah,
we have looked at that. That is the third option that's being studied right now, which is rebuilding the tracks along 169. The right-of-way is there for the most part. A lot of it's used for a bike trail. It runs at a diagonal from about Hopkins up to the corner of St. Louis Park and connects to the Burlington Northern Santa Fe up there, the Wyzetta line that comes into Minneapolis. There are 3 residential buildings that have been built on the right-of-way that would have to be purchased and removed. The entire process for rebuilding that line, besides displacing the bike trail and finding a new place for that, which, you know, bike advocates are very, very loud when they have to give up their bike trail. So it's, again, public process. But the cost of that would probably be in the neighborhood of, our first estimates are in the neighborhood of about $120 million. Nothing cheap in this game. And that line would be about 6 or 7 miles of brand new railroad. And that was abandoned. It was a Union Pacific line abandoned about 1984. It's been out of service that long. But that is an option.
Just an owned right-of-way, huh?
Yep.
So outside of your next stop here in this room on February 1st, where interested people, where might they go next?
They can look at the State Rail Plan site for some of the information. There is a project site, and I can't quote it to you right now. You can probably get it by calling St. Louis Park to the City Hall for information. That has a direct internet link to everything that has been discussed so far up there at St. Louis Park, including links to the Kenilworth study and the other studies that have been done. And like I say, that's an ongoing process. The next project meeting open to the public for that will be in approximately mid-February. And at that point in time, they will be talking about mitigation measures and the actual first cost estimates for constructing the line. So it's a process that will probably go on for another 3 or 4 months before any conclusion is reached and recommendations are taken to Hennepin County Board. They will be the first ones who will probably have to make a decision, but also everybody along the way, the railroad, the city, MnDOT, the Metropolitan Council, and even the Federal Railroad Administration will probably have to sign off on it before any final construction is done or any transfer of traffic is made. The decision could still be to keep it on the Kenilworth Trail, and then it's all a moot point.
Any last questions? No? Well, that was great. Thank you so much for coming and giving this information. Okay. All right. That was good. Our next thing, Planning Commission update. Commissioner Schroeder was not able to attend tonight. And also he let us know that he's the Planning Commissioner member on the ETC, and his term for that is up. So I'm sorry to see him go. I'll miss his insights and the eloquent way that he asks questions and they comment. So he knows where to find us if he wants to join us again. Bike Edina Task Force update. You had the November meeting minutes. We met again in January. One thing we worked on in January is we provided some feedback on landscape islands in the Gulf Terrace project, and everybody appreciated having the opportunity to discuss how landscape islands function for biking, and that has been forwarded to the City Council. And maybe Jack doesn't have any comments because he left himself off the agenda, or do you?
Didn't hear you.
You have no comments? Okay, no comments. I am actually going to start out the commission comments, and that is, this is our last meeting for Jeff, who was our fearless leader for a couple of years. I want to say thank you for your leadership and guidance and participation. We'll miss you. And with that, I will hand over commission comments to you to begin.
I actually have none. It's been a pleasure serving on the commission with you and to help serve the community and residents. It's something I'll look back on with a great deal of admiration and appreciation. Thanks very much for letting me sit with you.
Well, thank you for everything. Paul, do you have anything? If not, pass.
Nothing, just to thanks Jeff again for his leadership over the years.
Sarah? Okay, Tom?
Thank you very much, Jeff. Good job.
Thank you, Tom.
Aylin? Welcome again. Yes. We'll do more formal welcomes. You'll be welcomed a whole bunch. We are going to be welcoming also Catherine Bass and Michael Thompson, and we'll learn about them next time. Our Josh Sprague, who came from our humble beginnings and is now on the City Council, so that's why he's not here. And am I forgetting anybody? I don't think so. I thanked you already.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So thank you again, and I guess we are, with that, we're adjourned.
Yourself.